The nature of ethics, a provisional definition. In ordinary conversation, we often hear such statements as, he ought not to have done this. It is a good thing to help one's neighbors. He is thoroughly good man. His character is bad. He was only doing his duty. Or, it is always right to speak the truth. When such statements are made, they are frequently contradicted by someone hearing them, and this by itself suggests that they are not as simple as at first sight they appear to be. If a friend disagrees with my statement that Smith is a thoroughly good man, he may do so for one of two reasons. He may know facts about Smith's behavior which are unknown to me, and if he tells me these facts and convinces me that they are true, I shall then be ready to admit that Smith is in some respect not a good man. It may be the case, however, that my friend and I both know the same facts about Smith, and yet I continue to hold that Smith is thoroughly good, while my friend considers him to be bad. Now, we are using the words good and bad with different meanings, and until we come to some agreement as to their meanings, we are not likely to agree in our opinion of Smith. This is just the kind of question with which ethics deals. What is the true meaning of such words as good and right and ought, which are used so commonly in everyday conversation? When we come to an agreement as to the meaning of such words, other questions will arise. We may ask whether it is possible for us to know whether Smith is good or bad. We may ask on what grounds Smith should give up those activities which we have agreed to call bad, and should engage in those which we have agreed to call good. All these and many other similar questions are within the scope of ethics. We may define ethics as the normative science of the conduct of human beings living in societies, a science which judges this conduct to be right or wrong, to be good or bad, or in some similar way. This definition says, first of all, that ethics is a science, and a science may be defined as a systematic and more or less complete body of knowledge about a particular set of related events or objects. In this account of science, the important word is systematic. Scientific knowledge differs from the ordinary haphazard knowledge of uneducated people in being arranged in a definite, coherent system. A science also aims at providing as complete a knowledge of its subject matter as it can. Although, in the present state of knowledge, no science is perfect in this respect. At the same time, the scientist may leave out details that he knows in order to give a simpler and clearer presentation of the important connections of the facts which he studies. It is generally agreed that a piece of knowledge cannot be regarded as scientific until it is accepted by those who are learned in the particular science concerned. In medicine, for example, the new cures which are so convincingly advertised cannot be regarded as scientific until they have been recognized as effective by capable doctors. Finally, the sphere of a science is limited to one set of facts or objects. No science deals with all the facts known about the universe. To deal with the universe as a whole is a work of metaphysics or philosophy, which is not a science. Each science has its own particular sphere. Botany deals with plants, psychology with minds, and ethics with certain judgments that we make about human conduct. The sciences which are studied in the laboratories of our universities are descriptive or positive sciences. Positive sciences describe objects or phenomena as we observe them with our eyes and other sense organs, or in the case of mental processes like designing and willing as we observe them by introspection or looking inside our minds. Phenomenon is just the technical term for anything that can be observed in this way. There is in a positive science no question of judging its objects in any way. If the botanist judges a certain plant to be good or bad or even to be beautiful or ugly, he is no longer doing the work of a botanist whose business it is to describe what he observes without judging either its reality or its value. The psychologist describes the mental processes like intention and willing which lead to human conduct. But as psychologist, he has no concern with the goodness or badness of that conduct. There is a group of science, however, which do not deal directly with observed facts, which deal which deal as systematically and completely as is possible with the standards or rules or norms or criteria by which we judge certain objects. And these sciences are called normative sciences. Aesthetics, for example, deals systematically with the standards by which we judge objects of perception, commonly sights and sounds, to be beautiful or ugly. Logic deals with the standards by which we judge statements to be true or false, and ethics deals with the standards by which we judge human actions to be right or wrong. The normative sciences differ from the positive sciences in one more way. They do not merely describe the standards by which we judge, they are also concerned with the validity or truth of these standards. In ethics, for example, it is not enough to describe the rules by which men have tested their conduct, such as the Ten Commandments of the Hebrews. We also ask in ethics why these rules are valid or on what grounds we ought to observe them. Ethics has been defined as the normative science of conduct, and conduct is a collective name for voluntary actions. In common speech, we judge many things other than human actions to be good or bad. We speak, for example, of good wine and bad luck. The words good and bad are used ambiguously in ordinary speech. A single science may be required to deal with them in all their various meanings and to distinguish these meanings from one another. And such a science is sometimes called axiology or the science of values. We shall see later that one ethical theory holds that what we mean by calling an action right or good is that it leads to a result which is good in one of the various senses of good. And if this theory be accepted, a study of ethics would require to be completed by a study of axiology. At the outset, however, it will keep things more clear if we confine ethics to the study of human conduct and leave to axiology the study of other things that can be called good or bad. Conduct does not include those human activities like the circulation of the blood over which most normal people have no control, but it includes all voluntary actions. A voluntary action is an action that a man could have done differently if he had so chosen. Voluntary actions include all willed or volitional actions in which there is a conscious process of willing, like the action of a student matriculating in a university. Voluntary actions also include certain actions where there may be no conscious process of willing at all, provided that the doer could have prevented or changed the action by choosing to do so. A habitual action like a child sucking off his thumb or even a reflex action like blinking in a strong light may be voluntary, although the doer of these actions may not be thinking about them at all. The doer, by attending to them and choosing, could have done these actions differently or refrained from doing them at all, and so they must be regarded as voluntary. Sometimes people try to excuse their wrong actions by saying that these actions were not deliberately willed or chosen, as when a man continues a dishonest business practice of his predecessor without thinking about it. The question for ethics is not whether such an action was deliberately willed, but whether the doer could have prevented it by taking thought about it. If he could have prevented it, the action can certainly be judged to be a right or a wrong action. Although we may admit that its degree of rightness or wrongness may be affected by its deliberateness, conduct may include inward activities like motives and desires, as well as outward activities like speech and movements of the doer's limbs, and so these also will fall within the sphere of ethics. We so commonly think of these as causing outward bodily movements that we forget that they too are activities and liable to be judged good or bad even apart from the outward movements they produce. Our provisional definition has limited the conduct with which we deal in ethics in two ways. We deal with human actions and not with the actions of the lower animals. It may be admitted that there is something like human goodness about a dog's loyalty to its master, but psychologists are so far from agreeing as to whether any of the actions of the lower animals are voluntary in the sense given to this word in the last paragraph, that it would be unwise to add to our complications by including animal activities within the limits of our subject. A more arbitrary limitation is that of confining ethics to the study of the conduct of human beings living in societies. Some moralists would indeed go further and hold that the standards of ethics only apply to the relations of man with one another. The conduct studied in ethics is not only conduct done in a society but conduct that affects some other member or members of that society. It is worthwhile including a reference to society in our definition to remind ourselves that if it were not for his social background, a human being would not be a real human being capable of right and wrong actions. Aristotle expressed this by saying, he who is unable to live in society or who has no need because he is sufficient for himself must be either a beast or a god. Robinson Crusoe's conduct in the solitude of his desert island may be still judged good or bad, but according to this view, these terms would obtain their meaning from the social environment in which Crusoe had lived before he found himself in an uninhabited island, and to which there was always a hope that he might return. It may be for some purposes convenient to include in a single normative science the standards by which we judge all human activities, including those that appear to have no effects on other people or relations with them. And it is difficult to think of another name than ethics for such a science. Yet, common usage would certainly make a social activity like speaking the truth more directly the concern of ethics than a purely private activity with no marked social effects like stamp collecting or religious activity like fasting. Of course, such activities do have indirect social effects. The man who is fasting cannot share his food with the visitor, and so far his action would be judged by the standards of ethics. This limitation is one that may have to be given up on a fuller study of ethics. But in the beginning, we shall find it an advantage to emphasize the social background of the moral life and to confine the activities judged in ethics to those who done with the normal human background of social institutions and social relationships. There are several terms commonly used in judging human actions by ethical standards. We say that an action is good or bad, right or wrong, moral or immoral. We say that we ought to do an action, that we should do it, or that it is our duty to do it. And of another kind of action, we say that we ought not to do it, or we should not do it, or it is our duty not to do it. Of these terms, good and bad are probably the most common, but they are also the most troublesome. In the first place, they are used ambiguously in common speech. Not only are good works done by the pious, but the troublemaker enjoys a good fight, and the successful burglar makes a good haul from the safe which he has robbed. In fact, the word good, as commonly used, merely indicates an attitude of mind in favor of the object or event to which the term good is applied, and nothing more. So that almost anything may be termed good if anyone finds himself in favor of its existence, even to a very limited degree. The ordinary man seems to distinguish such a loose sense of good from a more definitely moral sense. But even about the moral sense, there's a great deal of ambiguity. We certainly think of morally good conduct not merely as that towards which men feel a favorable attitude. It is in some sense conduct worthy of arousing such a favorable attitude, or conduct that ought to arouse such an attitude. This is sometimes expressed by saying that when we call conduct good, we are approaching it from the standpoint of value. But surely value has just the same meaning as goodness in the widest axiological use of that term. It is convenient in ethics to use the words good or bad of an action when we are thinking of the action as leading to consequences which are good or bad in some sense of these very ambiguous terms. For example, consequences which satisfy our desires, but this limitation is hardly in accord with common sense. The whole range of the meanings of good will have to be considered when we come to those ethical theories which regard the goodness or rightness of an action as depending upon its power of producing good results. The word right and wrong have no such reference to consequences. They are used of actions that are in some way fitting to their circumstances. As when we say that a person said or did the right thing in an interview, the fittingness of a right action often appears to consist in its conformity to some rule, and the view that the moral life is a matter of obeying rules is a very common one. We think of an action as before a judge, and when he has passed his judgment, it is called right. There are, however, other uses of right than the moral one. We use it commonly in aesthetic judgments, such as this is the right kind of hat to go with this dress, or this word is just right in this line of the poem. In this aesthetic use, right also suggest fittingness to circumstances, but here this fittingness is an aesthetic one. The word right sometimes suggests that the action referred to is in some way obligatory. The doer or other people feel that he ought to do it. This is not always the case. It is right for a man to feel regret when his mother in law leaves his house, but no one could say that he ought to do so if his feelings are not under his control. This sense of obligatoriness is, however, definitely implied in the phrases he ought to do this, or it is his duty to do this, and it is one factor which influences the doer in doing or not doing the action. Such a judgment of oughtness or duty is very different from the judgment of goodness. We might all agree to say that it is good to eat ice cream on a very hot day, but no one would seriously say that we ought to eat ice cream, or that it is our duty to eat ice cream on a hot day, because we do not feel any obligation to do so unless we wish. It may be suggested that what distinguishes an action which we ought to do from one that is merely right is that when we ought to do an action, the action is not only right, but there are motives and inclinations in the mind of the doer which would hinder his doing it. We can say that the malaria patient ought to take his daily dose of quinine because the unpleasant taste of the medicine makes him strongly disinclined to do so. It is possible for more than one action to be right at the same time. It may be equally right for me to drink coffee or to drink tea at breakfast. It may be equally right for me to study economics or to study history in a university course. In such cases, we cannot say that I ought to drink coffee or that it is my duty to drink tea or that I ought to study economics or that it is my duty to study history. These phrases imply that there there is one and only one action which is right for me at the moment. If it is my duty now to study history, then no other action would be right at this moment. So that to study economics would be wrong for me. Of course, in a rather more elaborate way of speaking, I may be able to say that it is my duty to study either history or economics, but this would again imply that to study mathematics, at least on this particular occasion, would be wrong. The words ought and duty certainly apply only to right actions, but they suggest, if not imply, certain other things about these right actions. A. That they are obligatory on a particular individual. B. That there are tendencies in the mind of the doer making him disciplined to do them. And C. That one and only one action is right at a particular time. While these appear to be the distinction in common speech in the use of ethical terms, it is to be remembered that there may be a difference of emphasis or even meaning in the use of such terms by different persons. Some, like Kant, may feel a sense of awe in the presence of the statement that a certain action is a man's duty or that he ought to do it, but the moral judgment may arouse no such feeling in another man. The business of the student of ethics is to try to reach meanings which will be generally accepted by educated people, and also to limit these meanings so that the terms will be free from ambiguity and our use of them free from inconsistency. Yet we are not likely to attain this in ethics, for ethical terms, unlike the technical terms of the sciences, are words in common use on man's lips and are liable to constant change in emphasis and meaning. Moral sciences. An attempt has been made in the last section to give a definition of ethics and to explain the various words used in that definition. In the case of a subject like ethics, about the subject matter of which most people have some ideas, it is even more helpful to distinguish ethics from the other sciences dealing with human conduct, with which it may be confused. There are certain sciences in which we describe human conduct without expressing any opinion about its value or making any judgment about it. At present, the most scientific description of human conduct is probably that given by psychology, and one school of modern psychology, the behaviorist school, holds that the sole subject matter of a really scientific psychology is conduct or behavior. Most psychologists, however, hold the principal part of their field to be not so much the resulting conduct as the inward processes like intention and decision, which lead to outward conduct. One branch of psychology, now called social psychology, describes, among other things, conduct in its social relations, and this is the kind of conduct with which ethics is chiefly concerned. Human conduct is also described in sociology, which may be defined as the science of human society. And while the study of individual conduct has now become the sphere of social psychology rather than sociology, sociology still has for its subject matter the social institutions and customs which form the background of all human conduct, and especially the conduct directed towards other human beings, which is the special concern of ethics. Anthropology, in its widest sense, as the science of man, includes human conduct in its sphere, and a great deal of the work of anthropologists has been the description of the conduct and customs of primitive peoples. Indeed, the anthropologist has given so much attention to primitive peoples that we are apt to forget that anthropology deals properly with all mankind and not merely with savage peoples. And anthropology deals with more than conduct, it deals with the physical and mental characteristics of people which only affect their conduct indirectly. These three sciences, psychology, sociology, and anthropology, all provide us with facts about human conduct. And a general knowledge of such facts is a necessary preliminary to making true judgments about human conduct. Even such a brief survey of ethics as that contained in this book, it will be necessary to make a restatement of certain psychological and sociological facts in the second, third, and fourth chapters. Yet, just because these sciences are positive sciences which avoid judgments of value of any kind, we are not very likely to confuse them with ethics. There is, however, one branch of positive science which is nearer to ethics than the rest. The sociologist or the anthropologist may not only describe human conduct and its conditions, he may go on to describe the opinions that men have held in different ages and in different places about their own conduct and that of others, what kind of actions they have commonly regarded as good and right, and what kind of actions they have regarded as bad and wrong. This is what the sociologist Westermark has done in his book, The History of Human Marriage. He has not only described marriage, customs, and rights, but has told what people in different countries in different periods of history have thought right or have thought wrong in connection with marriage. Now, here the sociologist is still describing facts. He is not judging or evaluating them in any way. In this science, a sociologist may state that polygamy under certain conditions is considered right by Mohammedans but is considered wrong by Christians. But he has no right to go on to say that in this matter the judgment of Christians is true while that of Mohammedans is false or vice versa. To do so would be to leave the work of a positive science and to take up the work of ethics. We shall see in a later section on the methods of ethics that ethics must take into account the opinions of ordinary men on ethical matters, and to this extent, ethics is dependent on this descriptive science, which we may label the positive science of morals. At the present day, the word morals is used with a variety of meanings for the science of ethics itself, for actions regarded as good and right, and for the rules according to which such actions are done. It was originally derived from the Latin word mors, meaning customs, and so may be appropriately used for men's customary ways of judging human conduct. And that is what we are describing in this positive science. The word ethics, although it is indirectly derived from a Greek word also meaning custom, has by long technical usage been limited to the normative science, the science which tells not what men actually do and actually think it right to do, but what men ought to do and what they ought to think it right to do. In the normative science of ethics, we study the standards by which we judge actions to be right and wrong, good and bad, or in the other ways mentioned in the first section of this chapter. From another point of view, we ask what is the real meaning of these terms right and wrong, good and bad, and the rest. Once again, we are not asking what people think they mean when they use them. We are asking their true meaning or the only meaning in which they can be used correctly. Such an investigation will necessarily result in the discovery of standards or norms or criteria by which right actions can be distinguished from wrong actions or even better actions from good actions. The discovery and the establishment of such standards are the primary task of the normative science of ethics. The word establishment suggests that we cannot stop in ethics with merely stating the meaning or logical connotation of such terms as good and right and odd. Even if a person knew fully the characteristics of action implied by these terms, he might still go on to ask, why ought I to do what is right, or why ought I to avoid what is bad? It may be the case that an adequate definition of the terms right and odd and bad would supply the answers. But if that be the case, the definition itself often implies a certain view of the universe as a whole and of man's place in it. It is because of man's place in the universe that we can say that the certain actions are right or that he ought to do them. Even a philosopher who maintains that the meaning of ethical terms is not affected by the relations of our actions to anything else is still holding a certain metaphysical view of the universe, a view that he will need to defend in order to demonstrate that his ethical statement about goodness not being affected by relations is valid. Such a passage from science to philosophy has already been suggested when it was said the normative sciences do not merely describe the standards by which we judge, they are also concerned with the validity or truth of these standards. This is surely means the place of these standards in the whole scheme of things. It is, for example, a question for philosophy or metaphysics to decide whether our judgments of right and wrong are merely customary opinions that are created by our human minds with no fixed objective basis, or whether they state truths about the ultimate constitution of the universe.